Thank you for joining us here. I'm Dasha Burns. I'm the White House Bureau Chief for Politico and also host of The Conversation, our new Sunday show podcast. And here I have with me two senators with a lot to say today, I hope. Senator Jeanne Shaheen, I'm going to read your credentials here because you are involved in so much. Ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, co-chair of the Senate NATO Observer Group, Senate Armed Services Committee member, and Senator Coons, a ranking member on the Defense Subcommittee, Senate Appropriations Committee, ranking member East Asia and the Pacific, International Cybersecurity Policy Committee, and Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So basically all of the conversations that are happening here in NATO, you all are on a committee about, about those topics. Let's start with the big picture and the news that everyone is talking about, both here in The Hague and all around the world, which is the conflict between Israel and Iran. Senator Shaheen, I'll start with you. What is the role that the Senate should be playing here? What's happened has happened, right? I don't want to look backwards. The White House did make the decision to drop bombs on Iran's nuclear facilities. That is done, right? Moving forward, what role should the Senate play here?
Well, historically, the president has consulted with the leadership in the Congress before making that kind of a decision. That did not happen in this case. It happened with some Republican members. It did not happen with the Democratic members of the Senate. I think that's unfortunate because I think that's a conversation that would have been helpful, both to our understanding as members of the Senate of what the president was thinking, not just in terms of the airstrikes, which I think most of us could agree if we have either taken out or set back Iran's nuclear program, that's a good thing. But what happens next? There have been mixed messages out of the White House about whether, in fact, regime change is part of the goal. And so it would have been a good opportunity to learn more about the administration's thinking.
Did the White House explain to you why they didn't talk to Democrats and give the Democrats a heads up?
No.
You haven't gotten an explanation. Okay.
No.
Senator Coons, what, in your opinion, should the Senate's role be from here? And I know there might be a vote coming up soon on Senator Kane's war powers resolution. Is that the right approach?
Mm-hmm. Well, Dasha, you said in your opening comment, well, this is done. Let's look forward. First, we should assess whether it's done. So President Trump unilaterally authorized.
Well, I meant the action has been taken. What has happened is a question.
The impact of that action, we don't know. We don't have a full and competent battle damage assessment. We don't really know whether they succeeded in knocking out Iran's nuclear enrichment program. There are reports that Iran relocated enriched material before the strikes. Is that true or not? Is Fordo, is Isfahan, are they wiped out? Are they incapable of enriching now? Or were they only lightly damaged? We don't know, and we should know. And as Senator Shaheen said, the Senate should be consulted and actively involved. And to your point about a war powers resolution, if we don't have clarity about what risks and costs are associated with what may now be a sustained campaign to make sure that Iran's nuclear enrichment program is over, the Senate should vote on that. I expect we will in coming days. And we should get an assessment from the administration about what their strategy is. What's their plan? The president's been rage tweeting at Israel and Iran today. Getting them to a table where we can collectively negotiate to an end to Iran's nuclear enrichment program is the critical next step. And you really can't do that without the engagement of the American people and Congress.
Well, Senator Shaheen, you said earlier that if indeed we did significantly damage Iran's nuclear capabilities, that's a good thing. So congressional authorization aside, was this the right move by the Trump administration?
Well, as I said, if we have, in fact, either taken out Iran's nuclear program, and as Senator Coons says, we don't know that yet because we don't know what the assessment is of the damage, or badly set it back in ways that mean that they're not going to get a nuclear weapon anytime soon, I think that is a good thing because we have seen what Iran has done in supporting terrorism across the Middle East, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis. We've seen their threats against Americans, assassination attempts, their support for terrorist organizations. And I don't want a nuclear-armed Iran. I think that's a threat both to the United States, to the region, and to the world. So, but again, we're still assessing where we are in that attack.
The pretext for the strikes on Iran is that they were weeks away from having nuclear capabilities. Do you believe that was an accurate assessment? There's been some conflicting information coming out of our intelligence communities versus Israeli intelligence, which there are reports that we relied heavily on Israeli intelligence when it comes to that. What's your assessment?
You're not suggesting that there are mixed messages coming out of the White House, are you?
God forbid.
Sorry.
Look, I can't repeat what I was told in a classified briefing on this, but I think it's well and widely known that the American assessment for months, for years, has been that the Iranian supreme leader had not made a decision or given an order to move ahead with a nuclear weaponization program. It's clear that they were enriching at significant quantities and at higher levels than could possibly be justified for a civilian nuclear program. So the tension now for several years has been that Iran maintains that their nuclear program is peaceful, yet engages in activity that really one would only invest huge amounts of money and resources and time in if you were preparing to become a nuclear-armed state. There's a big step between having enough fissile material for a weapon and then actually building a deliverable weapon. But they were also working, for example, with uranium metals, shaping uranium metal, forming uranium metal. And the question now going forward, given that the IAEA declared them out of compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and their response was to say, we're going to have more enrichment in more secure sites you can't find. What will they do now after this strike? Will they abandon their program and negotiate an end to it? Or will they say, we're going to work harder, we're going to race towards a bomb because only a nuclear weapon can secure Iran against future attack? Look at Libya, look at Iraq. They toyed with having a weapon of mass destruction. They didn't. Ultimately, the regimes were overthrown. There are going to be factions within Iran that say the only appropriate response is to double down.
It does seem like this is a fork in the road for all of the parties involved, right? Which direction are you going to take? You mentioned regime change. We've seen that go awry in the past.
Very badly.
That's something that has been brought up by Israel. It's something that the president kind of toyed with in a recent post. Some more hawkish Republicans on the Hill have suggested it. My reporting so far in the West Wing, that does not seem to be a real option that's on the table. But do you believe that that would be a bad path to go down? Do you think it should be an option? What is your take on that possibility?
Well, we heard both the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, say that regime change was not the goal of the operation. The President suggested that maybe he would consider that.
Bless you.
Yes.
Excuse me.
So again,
Sneezing with a microphone.
Again, that's my concern about the mixed messages that are coming out of the White House. I think consultation with Congress would be helpful in this respect, to have some sense of whether, in fact, the president really is considering regime change.
Do you think he should?
I think we don't know the answer to that, because we don't know what the potential is for who would take over. If we take out the Ayatollah, what does that mean for Iran? It seems very clear that the intelligence says that there is no grassroots uprising in Iran that will bring democracy to the country or take over in a way that would dramatically change the government there. So is that better or worse? I don't think we know the answer to that, and I worry about making those kinds of decisions without having better answers than we've heard from the president.
Senator Coons, is there there seems to be some bipartisan agreement, and with a lot of the MAGA base, in fact, that getting further involved and entrenched in this conflict is a bad thing. Is there opportunity to work across the aisle more fulsomely, given there seems to be some real agreement on this issue?
Look, I think where there's agreement is on two fronts broadly. One is that our decades of war in Iraq and Afghanistan did not ultimately end well for the United States in terms of the huge cost, both the human cost and the sacrifices of our soldiers and the trillions that were spent. And that's made many Americans very hesitant about the idea of sending in American troops or being directly involved in trying to overthrow another government in the Middle East. We were not welcomed as champions with, bouquets of flowers and a flowering of democracy in Baghdad. Even though the initial stages of the war in Iraq seemed to go very well, and there was a lot of cheering about mission accomplished, it turned into a very long and very costly conflict. It also bears repeating that the regime in Iran is one of the worst in the world. They are the world's leading sponsor of terrorism. They have, as Senator Shaheen made clear, they've killed Americans. They've sponsored Hamas. They've helped arm Hezbollah. They've helped arm and train the Houthis. There's a lot of reasons to want the Iranian regime to change, but there is no clarity, I will agree, about what would come next and whether or not we would simply produce chaos in a very large country of more than 90 million people with a very sophisticated military and a very well-educated population. So we should study and debate carefully before doing anything that might lead us into another morass in the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, I am curious where you fall on that right now, though, because as you say that Congress should have more of a say in what we do here, I'm not clear whether you do think that regime change should be on the table or not.
It would not be a bad thing for the world. It would be a good thing for the world for the regime in Tehran to be gone. But the costs and consequences of attempting to do so or actually doing so are utterly unclear. Look at Libya. Was Muammar Gaddafi a good guy? No. Was he a fan or friend of the United States? No. Did he sponsor terrorism? Absolutely. Is the cost of the chaos and the civil war in Libya and then the consequences? There are 5 other countries in the immediate region that have been badly destabilized by the overthrow of Gaddafi and all of his weapons and all of the resources of Libya flowing into the Sahel. So, the old saying, you break it, you own it. If we end up having a central hand in the overthrow of the Iranian regime, we have to have thought through what comes next, because it could be more chaos.
Well, and I think there are a lot of voters that instinctively cringe at this idea because they do have those memories, right? And I interviewed Congressman Ro Khanna recently, who's been advocating for the Democratic Party to be the anti-war party. He said that the party has become too hawkish, in his opinion. Is this an opportunity for Democrats to move more in that direction, as you're hearing from Americans that they don't want us? I mean, one of the reasons so much of the president's base is frustrated is because they voted for him because they felt that he was the anti-war president, that he made promises that we would not be entangled in foreign conflicts. Is this an opportunity for Democrats? Might you be missing that opportunity if you don't sort of look at that messaging as a path for the party?
No. And I think Ro Khanna is wrong.
Okay.
The fact is, foreign policy isn't that easy. You can't just say, I'm against all conflicts, because they're all going to be against America's interest or against global interest.
What do you say to the
Look at where we are. We're at the
let
NATO
me finish.
summit.
yeah.
I think support for the war in Ukraine is very important to democracies around the world and very important to the United States and our own national security. I think it's an important message for us to send to our allies and partners as well as our adversaries. I don't want to be involved in any wars, isolationist movement. We've been down that road. We saw what happened at the start of World War II, and that was not a place where I think we want to be again as Americans. Now, that doesn't mean to say we want to get involved in every conflict, because we don't. I have real reservations about whether I think we should take step 2 in Iran. And that's why we need to hear from the president. The American people need to hear. We need to be able to ask those questions. But you don't just say, no, we're going to be against all wars everywhere, because that may not be what's in America's interest. And that may not be what keeps us safe and secure in the long run.
What do you say to the accusation that Democrats have become the party of war?
I think it's shallow and overly simplistic and wrong.
That's not what I'm hearing from my constituents.
How do you, in a world where nuance seems to have flown out the window, how do you message to American voters this sort of more complicated participation of the U.S. on the world stage, right? Where we don't want to go down old bad roads that didn't work, or we got overly involved in regime change and entangled in these conflicts for too long, but we're not going to say we're the anti-war party because there are some conflicts that are in our national interest to be involved in. I mean, even just saying that sentence out loud is like, how do you make an ad out of that?
You know, I think most voters are smarter than that. I think when I talk to voters in New Hampshire about the war in Ukraine, for example, or about what airstrikes in Iran, I haven't had a chance to talk with people about that because it just happened. But they may want to ask questions. They want to understand why it might be in America's national interest to do that, why it's important for them in their daily lives. And when you explain the case and engage with people, then they may agree or disagree, but at least you have a chance to have the conversation. And that's, again, I will go back to why I think it's important to brief Congress. Because we are the representatives of the American people. If the United States is going to get involved in another conflict, we need to have that conversation with the American people. And the president needs to explain as to us as representatives, and he needs to answer our questions about what comes next.
You know, as I was mingling with some folks here before we got on stage, one person said to me that, and this is something I've heard from a number of folks, that Congress has, over the last several administrations, increasingly ceded war powers to the executive branch. What do you say to that, and what do you want to see change? Senator Coons?
Look, Congress has ducked tough choices back to the Tonkin Gulf resolution. As wars unfolded over decades that were hard to resist because they began based on attacks on the United States or because the American people were fed bad information or bad intelligence, and I'm referring to the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. It was difficult, and so Congress largely avoided taking hard votes on whether or not to authorize or deauthorize wars. This is another moment where we can and should take a vote, but it should be a vote that is well informed. Let me go back to the question you were asking about the party of war, the party of peace. I think Democrats can and should be the party of smart power. We're at the NATO conference. America first should not mean America alone. Our view is that America is stronger and safer, more secure and more prosperous because of a global network of allies. When we come closer to Korea and Australia and Japan in the Indo-Pacific, when we come closer to countries like the Dutch, the French, the Germans, the British, who are either NATO or EU partners or both, these are countries we have long and deep relationships with, where we share free markets, free societies, a free press, and we are increasingly in a contest for this century against a grouping of countries, the PRC, DPRK, Iran, and Russia, that are authoritarian societies, that are aggressive and repressive societies, and there is an increasing definition in our world. It's really clear, at least to me, that the People's Republic of China intends to dominate this century, and they have a very different view of individual rights, of the role of the state, and of the future of technology and its purposes than the United States does. And we will succeed to the extent we are better coordinated with our partners and allies, not just in hard power, but in smart power, in diplomacy, development, and defense.
Smart power. That leads me to why we are actually here, which is for this NATO summit. Tell me about SNOG. the Senate NATO observer group. What is it? What is the role? What is the mandate?
The Senate NATO Observer Group was revised in 2018 by Tom Tillis, Republican from North Carolina, and me, as at a time when
Bipartisanship, what a beautiful thing.
yes, at a time when President Trump was questioning and his administration were questioning NATO and the value of NATO and whether the United States should withdraw from NATO. There was the original Senate NATO Observer Group was in the early 90s when NATO enlargement was happening, and it was formed to try and help make sure that senators knew what was going on with NATO enlargement. And so our thought was the timing would be right to reform this group to make sure that senators understand what's going on with NATO, what the president might be thinking, and how we can respond to that. And it has continued since then. It's bipartisan. I think there's 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans, and we are actually getting ready to introduce legislation that would codify the Senate NATO Observer Group so that it doesn't go away after Senator Tillis and I stop being co-chairs, that it continues.
Why does that matter?
Because I think, again, as Chris said so eloquently, NATO is in America's interest is being in NATO. We are stronger with our allies and partners, and it has served us very well, and it has become even stronger since the war in Ukraine with the addition of Sweden and Finland, as we think about the future challenges that we face, whether it's cyber or AI or hybrid warfare, disinformation, it's even more important to have this kind of alliance that provides security for all of the member nations.
You two have had some important meetings today. I want to see what kind of tea you can spill from those conversations. First, President Zelensky, you met with him today, that's right. What can you tell us about not just the substance of the conversation, but also how tense is this moment for someone like President Zelensky? What was the mood and the tone of those conversations?
He's a truly impressive leader. I got to tell you, we were in Munich at the Munich Security Conference just a few days before the overwhelming Russian invasion of Ukraine. Senator Shaheen and I went from Munich to Poland to see American troops training, and then Senator Durbin and I went on to Lithuania to see American troops training at the very front lines of NATO as that full-scale invasion began. And I remember reflecting on how calm and cool Zelensky was, and his comment in the very first days of that war when the United States offered to evacuate him, and he said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." He has continued to today's meeting to thank us for America's support, to urge us to sustain and strengthen that support. Some of his tone has changed on 2 substantive matters I'll reference. One is they're now looking to buy American armaments, not to have us donate them to them, and they are the world leader in cutting-edge technology, drone, counter-drone, electronic warfare. There's lots of countries and companies that want to partner with Ukraine in understanding how they've managed to MacGyver their way to, like, literally world-class.
So they don't want to be seen as charity or as getting handouts,
Not at all.
right?
And last, remember, they just carried out a stunning operation that was long time in the planning, where they deployed trailers of trucks that were full of drones and struck, in one case, an airbase almost 1,000 miles from Ukraine. They have changed the future of warfare, and they are not losing on the battlefield. So there was a confidence, a firmness, a clarity to President Zelensky today, but also clear gratitude to the United States for everything we've done, and then urging us to be partners with Ukraine in building the future of security.
And, you know, just to build on that a little bit and to go back to the conversation about why Ukraine, one of the things that is important about this war in Ukraine to the United States is not just what our support says to our allies and partners and to our adversaries, but it's also about the importance of ensuring that Ukraine, with the largest army in Europe, with the most technological and innovative approach to warfare that we have in the world right now does not wind up in Russia's orbit and in Russia's camp. It is in Europe's interest and in America's interest to make sure that that largest army in Europe, that technological advantage is on the side of the transatlantic alliance, not on Russia's side.
You also met with Secretary Rutte. He has seemed to navigate this with true diplomacy, right? He's figured his way around Trump world and around American politics quite well. But in behind closed doors, again, I know there's a lot you can't tell us. But what are the top concerns? What was this sort of central theme of your conversation?
It was about NATO and the future of NATO, and
the future of NATO is.
I think having the United States continue to be a strong partner in NATO is important, and we talked about that a little bit and about the support in the Senate with the Senate NATO Observer Group, because he had been to Washington and met with us when he was there. And listen, he's had a number of years operating coalitions in the Netherlands in a way that is very impressive. So he has the background to do this job, and as we're seeing at this summit, is doing it very well.
Getting to 5%, getting
I was going to ask, how do those spending targets
is an enormous accomplishment. But what matters more than the spending is spending in a wise and coordinated and innovative way. If we don't coordinate better than we have, and if we don't modernize our procurement systems and Europe's procurement systems, we'll simply run up the price. We'll simply end up spending inflated dollars chasing a few products and a few manufacturers. So across many conversations today, part of the point was to say we're not just going to step forward and all spend more, we're going to spend it wisely. We're going to build joint capabilities. So when we met with Ursula von der Leyen, for example, one of the things the EU is doing is making available a 150 billion euro fund for joint procurement and for streamlining and innovation in terms of future security investments. We need to have American firms, well, they are already. We need to have American security firms manufacturing in Europe in joint co-production, and we need European firms manufacturing and developing things in the United States, because frankly, we need to strengthen and deepen our coalitions, and we need to spend those additional dollars and euros in a more effective way if we're going to succeed in this century.
I mean, many presidents have called on NATO members to pay their fair share, but it did happen under President Trump. Is that something you give him some credit for?
Yes, but I give Vladimir Putin a lot of credit for that, because I think it's the threat from Russia that has really helped to wake Europe up to the real threat that we're facing.
Given all of what's going on in the world, it seems like some other big headlines have been forgotten. For example, we were dealing in the first 100+ days with the trade war and the tariffs, and that's still absolutely happening. And I don't want that to get overshadowed because it is a huge shift in the world economic order. How has that the context played into your conversations here, and how our allies feel about our relationship given the sort of whiplash of tariffs and trade war?
You know, it hasn't been a major part of the conversation, I think, because we're in agreement with most of the people that we've met.
What do you mean by that?
That while tariffs may make sense in particular industries for the United States in a targeted way, blanket tariffs, as the president has proposed, I don't think makes sense. And particularly as we're thinking about procurement on the defense side and what we may need to do, supply chain challenges, the blanket tariffs and a trade war make all of those issues much more complicated and more difficult. So I don't think that that is the right approach as we're looking at the challenges that we have on the defense side.
It's created huge instability in future planning for our close partners and allies in terms of what they can afford to invest in, and it's created real instability and uncertainty in our relationships with our closest allies. So frankly, what I think you're hearing Senator Shaheen say, and I agree with, is that tariffs should be a targeted tool. not just an axe that you wield dividing us from our closest allies. The whole point here at NATO is that Europe is really stepping forward to genuinely share the burden of our collective defense. The expiration of the threat of, I think it was 20% tariffs across the board to EU products is July 9th. That's just around the corner. And we're still fighting over massive potential tariffs on steel and aluminum, on automobiles and pharmaceuticals. We need to bring some of that temperature down, move towards genuine trade fairness. But bluntly, there are things that unite the United States and Europe that are far deeper than whether or not we've got a great trade balance. And by the way, we're in the Netherlands, which frankly has the best trade balance with the United States of any country in Europe, and is one of the major investors in innovation and manufacturing in the United States. Might be a nice place for a timeout from the tariff war.
Oh, that's a great idea. Well, listen, you both sit on some powerful committees. However, Democrats are in the minority right now. What recourse do you have on some of these issues that we've been talking about today, given you're not in power?
We're not in power. That's when the Republican Party or one party controls all three branches of government. And it means that we need to continue to work with our colleagues to try and make the case, and they may or may not agree with us. And the next recourse we have is the election next year. And as we saw with the No Kings rallies, there's going to be a lot of interest in those elections.
You talked about messaging earlier. How do you think the Democrats are doing on finding a message as we do get closer to a time when voters can have their say? And that message policy is important, but how you talk about that policy can sometimes make or break a party.
Look, I think we're showing more message discipline right now. And, frankly, the markets get a vote too. One of the core promises that elected President Donald Trump was his promise to bring prices down. I don't think your average American is seeing a big drop in their daily prices. In fact, if anything, I think some of the tariff chaos has raised prices in housing and gas and pharmaceuticals. So we're going to see where we are a year from now. But so far, I don't see the kind of leadership on economic issues from President Trump that will make that easier. We are going to go back to a very contentious vote that's in the next couple of days. And our Democratic Party messaging on that vote is unanimous. There's no disagreement. This is a bill that will cut hundreds of billions of dollars out of support for health care, for disabled people, for children, for seniors, billions and billions out of food for hungry children. It slashes programs that Democrats have long stood for and fought for in order to pay for extending a massive tax cut to the very wealthiest Americans and most profitable companies. That sharp division in priorities really identifies the current break between most Democrats and, no, all Democrats in the Senate and all Republicans. And just to put in one quick plug for our colleague, Senator Tillis, he is back in Washington working to change.
Yeah, we thought he was going to be here with you all today, but
and he's working
to
to change that package in a way that I think better reflects the priorities of his home state. I'm sort of playing Senator Tillis. This should be a bipartisan pair between Senator Shaheen and Senator Tillis right now, but that's an incredibly consequential vote, and it's coming up soon. When Democrats had the capacity to pass through reconciliation a bill, what did we do? We reduced the cost of prescription drugs, and we fought climate change by investing in clean energy. And the time before that, we passed the Affordable Care Act, which made health care more affordable, more accessible. What have the Republicans done with this opportunity under President Trump? Cut taxes, cut taxes.
Well, and they're going to raise the cost of health care.
Yep.
They're going to put rural hospitals out of work. I mean, we have rural hospitals in our state who, if we reduce Medicaid to the levels that are being talked about in this bill, they are not going to be able to continue to operate. And they're going to reduce the energy tax credits that so many companies have relied on to create jobs and to produce alternative energy. I think the American people will understand what's in their interest.
Senator Shaheen, I do wonder, so you've announced that you're not running again. So I wonder if we could get a little bit of Jeanne Shaheen unleashed here. What is your message to your party as the Democrats look for a path forward? And in the context of you're seeing sort of this fight within the DNC, some younger members like David Hogg wanting to primary, older Republicans in blue districts. You're seeing some people wanting to be the resistance to President Trump, others wanting to work in bipartisan fashion. It seems like Democrats are still struggling to find a footing of like how to navigate this moment. And of course, that's a challenge when you don't have a clear leader, right? That is driving the message. So right now, you got nothing to lose here. What is?
Listen, I think that message is one that is being pushed by members of the media, and it's
all our fault. I get it.
and. Listen,
no, but it's storylines that are playing out.
Every presidential look. I've been in politics for over 50 years. And every time there's a change in presidential leadership, that's the message. Oh, what happened to the Republican Party? What happened to the Democratic Party?
But isn't
it's
that
the party that's out of power, and that's the way our system works. And when we get back in power, which I have no doubt we will do.
But to get back in power, you have to have a message, and you have to have a path.
And we do have a message, and that message is we stand for opportunities for the American people. We stand for a tax system that's fair and equitable. We stand for ensuring that people can afford health care and get access to it. We stand for alternative energy. That means that we're creating good energy jobs and we're not dependent on fossil fuel that's driving up costs and making our environment untenable. There is no doubt that Democrats have a message. But until we have a candidate for president, that message is not going to be heard in the same way that it's being heard from Donald Trump and the Republicans. So that's the way the system works.
Do you think enough members of your party are talking about those issues and in the way that you just put them?
I do. When we have an opportunity, absolutely, I think so. You just listen to the debate around this big, beautiful betrayal of the American people, this reconciliation bill that we're going to vote on this week. And I'll guarantee you're going to hear a message that says all of those things I just talked about.
Senators, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it, and good luck with the rest of your time here at NATO.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.